Hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the Italian Research Seminar. Thanks for joining us. My name is Charles Levitt. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Italian Studies, which is a hub for collaboration on Italian studies with faculty across the university, advancing the center's research mission and supporting teaching across the disciplines. And in addition to counting more than 75 Notre Dame faculty members as affiliates, the center also brings together a much broader community of external affiliates from institutions worldwide. And indeed, the center exists, at least in part, to support the work of this global network of Italianists and to facilitate international and interdisciplinary collaborations with our affiliates. And I would say also to highlight the accomplishments of our affiliates. And that brings me to today's speaker, because I have the honor this afternoon of introducing a distinguished affiliate of the Center for Italian Studies, who will deliver the second in our Italian Research Seminar series this fall. Beth Coggeshall is Assistant Professor of Italian at Florida State University. She specializes in the literature and culture of medieval Italy, with a particular focus on Dante. Her research centers on the intersections of literature, ethics, and cultural identity, medievalism and popular culture, and the transmedia reception of Dante's works across contemporary global cultures. Professor Coggeshall is also Vice President of the Dante Society of America and the co-editor of the website Dante Today, sightings and sightings of Dante's work in contemporary culture. And I think that those two roles might demonstrate her commitment to public outreach and bringing new readers to Dante. And with that in mind, I wanted to highlight, in addition to the lecture that we can all look forward to now, another event that Professor Coggeshall has been kind enough to offer during her stay at Notre Dame, which is a postgraduate careers seminar to reflect on what one can do with postgraduate degrees in the humanities broadly and in Italian studies specifically. That's going to take place tomorrow morning in Duncan, room 512, from 9 to 10:30 a.m., and refreshments are on offer. So I hope that you'll join us there. And in addition to everything that I said thus far about our wonderful guest, I wanted to highlight one more point, which is that Professor Coggeshall is also an alumna of the University of Notre Dame, where she earned her PA in medieval studies and Italian, and where she hailed from Walsh Hall. Since I see no undergraduates here, I think you'd like to know. There we go. And she's the author of Amicizia, Negotiating Friendship in Dante's Italy from the University of Toronto Press, 2023, which critics have called a nuanced, contextualized picture of friendship, a timely and immensely valuable contribution to our understanding of Dante and his social network, and a major contribution to the flourishing field of Dante studies. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Beth Coggeshall.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles, so much for the introduction. And thank you so much to the Center for Italian Studies for sponsoring and organizing this series of seminars, and for all of the excellent research that you support and produce. It's really extraordinary what comes out of the University of Notre Dame. I want to thank the Center for Italian Studies in particular for inviting me to return to my alma mater, the Romance Languages Department at Notre Dame. It is especially delightful to be here among friends, both old and new, to present my research on amicizia, which is the subject of the book that came out this spring with University of Toronto Press. And I've added a QR code to the slide that you can scan if you would like more information about the book. This book, I was thinking about it this afternoon as I was walking around campus. This book really has it had its beginnings in Christian Maeve's courses on Dante when I was just a wee sophomore in college. I hope that you'll see that much of the thinking that I do in this project is reflective of the spirit of what Notre Dame Dante Studies has produced over these last many decades. So here's what I'm going to do today. So as I said, I'll be talking about my research into amicizia, and especially the ambiguities and ambivalences around the idea of amicizia, or friendship, across Dante's writings. So we tend to think, and especially to write about friendship as a universal value, an unambiguous moral good. But for Dante and his interlocutors, the many forms of friendship raised a number of social and ethical dilemmas that needed very careful attention and negotiation. So I'm interested in this project not so much in what friendship is to Dante and his peers, but rather what it does. how it's used, what ends it serves. So I'm going to start with a discussion of these dilemmas in very broad strokes, how they emerge from the conflicting views expressed by classical and Christian authorities on friendship, and how these conflicting views get integrated into a variety of strategic practices that would allow vernacular writers a certain flexibility to express themselves differently depending on the social field in which they were writing. Then I'm going to turn to a specific case study, one that I've selected precisely to solicit the feedback of this audience, which is Dante's often conflicting discussions of friendship across the Commedia, and particularly in Purgatorio, as well as the difficulty of their resolution in Paradiso. So I selected that section of the book because here I really felt like I hadn't yet found the answer that I had been seeking. And so in the spirit of work in progress, which is what I understand this seminar to embody, I present it to you today for us to think through together. And then I'll conclude with the briefest of gestures forward to think about how the messy negotiations of late medieval Italian writers paved the way for the wholesale recuperation of friendship in its many forms and expressions among the early humanists. And here again, I would really welcome feedback, suggestions, etc. So let's start with the broad strokes. As I said, I'll start by laying out some of the dilemmas of amicizia that needed to be negotiated by late medieval authors, leading toward the early humanists' recuperation of the term. So this will be part one of the talk. As we all know, in the opening scene of Inferno, Dante's pilgrim famously finds himself lost and alone in a dark wood, his terrifying solitude enacting the sinner's estrangement from the Christian community. The pilgrim's paralyzing solitude is quickly remedied, of course, as the shade of Virgil appears to explain that Beatrice, the pilgrim's long-deceased love, has enlisted Virgil to guide her friend from the deserted shores to the safety of the city. Amico mio, she calls him, my friend, and no friend of fortune. So on its face, Beatrice's self-definition as amico of the pilgrim seems warranted, perhaps even expected. And some scholars have sought to demonstrate the consistency of her use of the term with contemporary sources on friendship, primarily with Aristotelian and Ciceronian claims of mutuality and virtue that have been reconsidered, transmuted, or transformed in the light of Christian salvation. Furthermore, her use of the term amico to describe or perhaps even recast an erotic relationship appears to derive directly from Cicero's own etymology of the term, amicizia, which he claims gets its very name from the word amor. Her self-definition as friend accords with the term's usage among the troubadours, for example, who frequently referred to lovers as amis, charging the terms of friendship with erotic voltage, or with the letters of Heloise to Abelard, in which Heloise claims that she would prefer that Abelard call her amica rather than wife. The word is frequently translated as mistress. And it shares echoes with the Song of Songs, wherein the bridegroom refers to his beloved as amica mea. Indeed, it seems at a certain point that Beatrice could scarcely have called the pilgrim by any other name. And yet, Beatrice's use of the term amico mio to describe the pilgrim is one of the most complicated uses of the term that we find across Dante's entire corpus, precisely for its distinction from the ways that he employs the term elsewhere. This is the only time in his corpus that he'll assign the name of friendship to his relationship to Beatrice, and Beatrice is the only figure in the entire Commedia to refer to the pilgrim by the name friend. That's a statistic that I found stunning when I found it. Not to mention that she does so only in speech that's reported secondhand to the pilgrim by Virgil, in the not always reliable mouth of this classical figure. Furthermore, in the latter half of the Italian Duecento, the term had taken on great ambivalence in other spheres of literary activity. For the vernacular poets of Dante's generation, the terms of friendship, amicizia, amistade, and amistà in Dante's Italian, not only pervade literary discourse, they're indeed constitutive of that discourse. So what I mean by that is that poets relied on their so-called amici to promote and circulate their poems, calling on various types of friend to solidify their claims to entry into and centrality within literary networks, whether the figurative piazza of lyric exchange, the academic studium and its correlated intellectual circles, or the signorial courts with their far-reaching networks of influence. For vernacular writers of this generation, amistà and its related terms were redolent with tensions that would carry practical social consequences in the various literary milieu of northern Italy at the turn of the 14th century. This So these negotiations are the subject of my book on amistad. In the book, I examine the strategic ways that Dante, in conversation with his peers, employs the terminology of amistad over the course of his literary career as indications of an emergent and disruptive contestation over the value of friendship in the competitive literary communities of the northern Italian urban centers. This contestation, which took shape in the decades preceding the momentous cultural shift toward early humanism, ultimately secured the value of preferential, individual, and instrumental attachments, framed as amistadi, within the poetic agora of northern Italy. In other words, if we want to understand how Petrarch could become the first modern friend, as Hannah Wojciechowski has notably described him, we have to look very carefully at the ways his immediate predecessors thought about their amici. While Petrarch and the other early humanists would come to view even instrumental friendships as critical to healthy human sociability and moral development, the writers and thinkers of the generation preceding discussed friendship as a much more fraught relationship than has previously been considered, complicated by certain sociopolitical tensions and intellectual disruptions that are specific to this time and place. My project takes Beatrice's gesture toward her amico in this critical opening scene as the culmination of a long series of complex ethical negotiations around the value of friendship undertaken by Dante in conversation with his contemporaries in the last decades of the Italian medieval period. As we come to see, the picture of friendship that emerges over the course of Dante's works, counterintuitively perhaps, favors exclusivity, competition, self-interest, hierarchy, and difference. These preferences challenge the theoretical notions of amicizia espoused by both classical and Christian authorities alike, and the strategic pursuit of such qualities in friendship provides the ethical rationale for what has been described as the expanding menu of types of amicizia that could be claimed and exploited by early humanist writers. For humanist writers, amicizia would become the most capacious and adaptable descriptor of human relationships. Friendship would not be treated as the uniquely moral bedrock of human society that we might imagine, but as a sometimes disingenuous, often self-interested, and always dynamic frame for all manner of social relations, both those that strove toward a universal kind of virtue and those that did not. Such a flexible conception of friendship is often attributed to the rediscovery of the letters of Cicero and Seneca, or to the resurgence of a culture of Latinate Stoicism. But the possibilities and the pitfalls of such a capacious category of human sociability had already begun to be mined by the writers of the generation preceding the early humanists and their rediscoveries. The literati of Dante's generation had inherited from medieval monastic thinkers and Aristotelian commentators a set of conflicting views on the value and function of individual preferential friendships in the creation of a broader spirit of community. In the works of their predecessors, they identified certain theoretical disputes around the problems and possibilities inherent to the concept of amicizia. Here are some of the questions that are implied in their texts. Was friendship an exercise of preference and exclusion that would admit only two or at most a few into a tight circle? Or was it a love that could bind many, even all, within its expansive reach, akin to Aristotle's idea of politike philia, or to the Christian notion of agape? Was friendship uniquely tied to the mutual pursuit of virtue, or could it permit of other, less stable ends? Was friendship possible between friends of unequal rank, or did the introduction of social and economic inequalities promote self-interest, flattery, even deception among the ostensible friends, such that friendship was nullified by rivalry? Lastly, did friendship depend on a certain likeness between friends, or was it possible to love those who were quite different from you for themselves, without desiring to change them? These are the questions that animate my research. So in the book, I identified 4 dilemmas that take shape in the discourse surrounding friendship, both within Dante's works and in those with which his works are in direct dialogue. So the dilemmas I identified are as follows, deriving from these questions. They are an impulse toward network building, inclusivity, or a preferential dyadic exclusivity, the pursuit of noble disinterestedness, or of self-serving personal advantage, the maintenance of a hierarchical social order, or the construction of an imagined equality, and finally, a uniformity that would be productive of likeness and harmony, or a multiplicity that privileges difference and diversity as enriching to the human experience. Some of these dilemmas may have been resolved in theory, but in the public practice of friendship, Dante and his peers struggled to assimilate theoretical precepts into the socio-political realities of civic life. Friendship was the object of reverence, insofar as it was productive of moral excellence and civic virtue, but also of suspicion as regards its ability to integrate larger communities, to exist within hierarchical social structures, and to inspire rivalries, even seemingly virtuous or noble ones. As Aristotelian ethical theory was mapped onto Christian intellectual societies, authors in the nascent vernacular tradition were presented with contradictory tenets which demanded negotiation. They conducted these negotiations in the exchanges of texts, letters, correspondence, poems, dedications, narratives, even treatises, which pretend to a kind of universal reach. In these texts, late medieval authors would contest, both implicitly and explicitly, the ethics of friendship practices like agreement and dispute, imitation and dedication, praise and reproach, flattery and self-promotion, and so on. Practices like these are always enmeshed in systems of strategic intervention, and here I'm going to detour into some 20th century critical theory. As Pierre Bourdieu has argued, practices are structured by both the field, or champ, in which they take shape, and by embodied dispositions toward patterns of perception and behavior. Within a particular field, individuals are positioned relative to one another in objective relationship to other participants. Position is determined by the distribution of multiple forms of capital, for example, wealth, reputation, fame, virtue, education, the esteem of one's peers or of one's patron, all of which are valued and exchanged differently depending on the social system in which they take shape. One's practices within a specific field, may be improvised and innovative, but they're governed by the rules of that particular field, and by one's position in that field relative to the other players. Within specific fields of practice, participants must negotiate their positions relative to one another through a series of strategic moves in what Bourdieu calls the game of honor. That practices are embedded in fields where agents are differently positioned according to the various types of capital they have acquired, and where particular sets of rules regulate participants' behavior, does not imply that practices are mechanized. Neither, however, are those practices fully conscious and freely chosen. Rather, like the well-trained players of a game or sport, participants develop what Bourdieu calls a practical mastery within specific social fields, an embodied set of regularized behaviors and perceptions that governs but does not fully determine their interventions in the field. Practices then are strategic, but they're also structured by and within the specific field in which they're undertaken. Treating professions of friendship in medieval Italian texts as strategic practices within particular arenas of symbolic exchange allows us to chart these vernacular poets' negotiations of contradictory socio-ethical claims in this period of great cultural, intellectual, demographic, and social change. I approach specific sites like the literary piazza, the academic network, the patron's court, and each of the realms of Dante's afterlife as fields in Bourdieu's sense. And I examine literary practices within those fields, like praise and reproach, dedication, and so on, as motivated by the desire to accumulate symbolic capital and acquire mastery within the specific field in which they're undertaken. I map these four fields onto four of Dante's key texts: Vita Nova, De Vulgari Eloquentia, the opening paragraphs of the Epistle to Can Grande, and the Commedia. I contextualize those readings with additional investigation of contemporary sources, some well-studied, some less known. Sources like Tensoni, epistles, encomia, dedications, and treatises, both secular and religious. Brunettottini, Guitone d'Arezzo, and Guitone's imitators all feature prominently in the corpus of texts gathered here, as do Dante's principal amici, Guido Cavalcanti, Cina da Pistoia, Can Grande della Scala, Forese Donati, His Sister Piccarda, and with important caveats, Beatrice Portinari. In each of these cases, what is more important than the biographical reality of Dante's private affective attachment to one friend or another is the fact that he conceived of those relationships as friendships, with all of friendship's attendant benefits and duties, as they were framed following Aristotelian precepts: reciprocal goodwill, trust, loyalty, and the equal exchange of goods and services. Okay, those are the broad strokes of the argument. So now that we've seen those broad strokes, let's turn in part two to a specific case study of the ways that these strategic negotiations unfold in texts. So this example is taken from my final chapter on the Commedia. We might imagine that by the time Beatrice intones her call to l'amico mio e non dell'avventura, that the tensions around amicizia would have found resolution in Dante's works. And yet Beatrice's amico resonated for Dante's contemporary audience within a complex and nuanced register of meanings and practices that would have been largely illegible to a classical practitioner of friendship. If indeed Beatrice channels the classical notion of vera amicizia in her pronouncement, her labeling the pilgrim amico mio would be a unique instance in Dante's corpus, where classical amicizia would have reached its fullest reconciliation with Christian thought. This has been argued many times. It is, of course, possible that the Commedia presents a vision of Beatrice's amistà quite unlike all the other articulations of friendship that we find elsewhere across Dante's corpus. That only here, on his journey to salvation, does the poet finally grasp the fullest meaning of vera amicizia as described by the ancients. In light of the dilemmas that my book identifies in the theories and practices of friendship among Dante and his interlocutors, however, I find the readings that would set Beatrice's friendship apart from all others oversimplifying. While we may want to ascribe to Beatrice's word amico a fluid transformation of eros to amicizia and amicizia finally to caritas, or while we may wish to hear in it a smooth consolidation of classical authorities in Christian doctrine, we're instead, still here in the Commedia, left with the same complicated nexus of political, theological, and sociological meanings that need to be negotiated carefully, attending to their polyphonous resonances. In other words, we need to hear also in her expression, amico mio, a negotiation with the dilemmas and that the ethics and practices of friendship would have raised for Dante and for his contemporaries. To examine the ways that the dilemmas of friendship remain for Dante in the conception of the Commedia, I turn to the practices of friendship as they appear in the three realms of Dante's afterlife, each of which I treat like its own champ, its own field, with its own goals and its own forms of capital. Each of the dilemmas that I explore in the other chapters appear here as well: exclusivity, self-interest, hierarchy. And when I set out on the project, I planned to argue that these dilemmas are resolved in the realms of salvation. It turns out that this is not the case, and I'll return to that point at the end. What I found especially interesting, particularly in writing about Purgatorio and Paradiso, was that an entirely new dilemma emerged: difference and sameness. This dichotomy lies at the heart of Cicero's De Amicizia, consistently held to be the most authoritative treatise on medieval friendship. Cicero's pronouncements on the love of true friends are often boiled down to a single pithy justification. One loves a friend, animis qui est tamquam alter idem. For a friend is, quite simply, another self. Defining a friend alter idem would become an immediate commonplace among Cicero's heirs. In fact, it's still a commonplace that we use today. The phrase, which is often rendered in modern English as a second self, implies the great likeness shared between two friends, so powerful as to overcome the necessary otherness of human subjectivity. Friendship, in Cicero's definition, has the unique capability to cross the boundaries that differentiate self from other, making, as he says immediately following, unum ex duobus. Many scholars who take up Cicero's definitions to read the friendships between Dante and his companions in the Commedia and other works emphasize the likeness between these friends. Relying on another definition of Cicero's, they say that friends have shown agreement on matters both human and divine. They talk about the alignment of their goals, commitments, and interests, their mutual support, judgment, generosity, loyalty, etc. And yet Cicero's definition of friendship as a unifying force does not collapse the distinctions between one and the other. Instead, his definition highlights otherness and difference in its paradoxical structure. The friend is alter idem, not a second self, but an other same, both same and other at the same time. The paradoxical other sameness of the friend, little explored in the medieval reception of Cicero's work, is not lost on the author of the Commedia, a poem which revels in the complex, multiform expressions of human identity and sociability. This new dilemma, difference and sameness, only adds to the set of friendship dilemmas that are explored in the vast social universe of the Commedia. Would individual and preferential friendships be an integral step to uniting the souls in purgatory? Or would individual friendships be a pleasant distraction, much like Casella's song, On the Shores of the Mountain? Could that kind of friendship celebrated by the ancients, theoretically productive of virtue, but elevating, isolating, often competitive in practice, be assimilated into Christian modes of loving? Or would it be set aside in favor of other forms of relationship that are less redolent with the tensions of hierarchy, rivalry, and exclusion? Nowhere in the Commedia will negotiating the dilemmas of friendship be so prevalent as they are in Purgatorio. On the one hand, Purgatorio, the so-called Cantica dell'amicizia, seems to insist on the necessity of individual friendship to the development of virtue. The value of one's elective, private attachments to the affective restructuring of purgatory seem to be on full display, as we see in the repeated encounters with friends throughout the pilgrim's purgatorial journey. We see Casella greeting the pilgrim by singing one of Dante's own lyrics, Bell'acqua and the pilgrim exchanging teasing quips, Nino Visconti moving toward him in irrepressible joy, Forese and Dante swapping news of old Florentine compatriots, Matilda affectionately welcoming him in earthly paradise, joining him as both object of erotic desire and compassionate companion. Allusions to friends, allies, and patrons abound, from Giotto and Guido Cavalcanti to Guido da Castello, Gerardo da Camino, as well as the Malaspina family. Attempted embraces, which most often fail or are interrupted, accompany greetings of compassion and care. Friends are everywhere in purgatory. And yet, the language of friendship, the terminology of friendship, terms like amico, amistà, amicizia, goes nearly silent in the Commedia, especially when contrasted with its frequent appearance elsewhere in Dante's corpus. For a work that so many scholars have seen as steeped in the relationships and gestures of individual friendship, the term amico itself, so present in Dante's lyric and epistolary corpora, appears with surprising rarity in discussions of friendship among sage souls. As I mentioned above, Beatrice is the only character to use the name amico to describe the pilgrim, and this only in speech reported by the pagan Virgil. Virgil likewise uses the term in his exuberant greeting of Statius, but he uses it with such precision, such awareness of the classical lexicon of loving, that it appears strikingly different from the loose expressions of the penitents, who favor the language of brotherhood over that of friendship. Because of the absence of the term, we might imagine that private, preferential, individual friendship, individual amistà, especially as it had been understood throughout Dante's Opere Minori, would not be the correct disposition among the penitents in purgatory. The aim of purgatory, after all, is to cleanse the individual of sin and to prepare each penitent for the collective embrace enjoyed by the saints in paradise. It might well be argued that this individual work could or should only be accomplished alone. John Tooke, for one, stresses the pilgrim's private experience of penance in Purgatorio, noting, I'm quoting, "For all his breaking bread with those he meets along the way, the meaning of the term companion, it is nonetheless the resolution of his own humanity, the restructuring of his own affective existence, that occupies the mind of the pilgrim poet as he makes his, properly speaking, still solitary ascent," end quote. Preparing to join the paradisical collective involves a dialectical process. On the one hand, John Tooke is absolutely right. Each individual soul must make a solitary journey of reckoning with his or her own private misalignment of will. On the other hand, the souls must learn to unite their wills as a broader community, in companionship with one another, as preparation to join the paradisical collective. In neither of these endeavors, the personal or the collective, does the dyadic structure of private friendship seem to serve an essential strategic purpose. Dyadic friendship, the friendship of two, seems to draw two friends away from the rest of the community, separating them from their companions as they delight in private, intimate conversations and recollections. The danger of friendship's potential to exclude others is one that Dante, of course, knew well and indeed celebrated in his earlier works, as we see in the dream vision, Guido I vorrei che tu e Lapo io. The earlier sonnet yearns that Dante, Guido, and Lapo would be messi in un vaselle, which would set out to sea, sì che fortuna o l'altro temporio non ci potesse dare impedimento. The elite group of friends would exercise their virtue in rational activity, that is, in dialogue with one another. This is Dante's ragionar in verse 12. A conversation that in the sonnet is concentrated fixedly on the matters of love. The poem, which is styled as a placer, crafts the scenario of separation from the world and its cares. Dante desires that he and his friends sail away from the political and social strife of the city on a magical boat on a peaceful sea, enjoying a unity that among themselves that Teodoro de Barbini would characterize as a distant preview of Trinitarian wholeness. Guido Ivorei captures both the exclusive desire at the base of friendship and the pitfalls associated with the realization of such a desire. The sonnet's wish for exclusive and intimate friendship depends on an impossible escape from the human social realm and its vicissitudes. Such an impulse renders the sonnet's vision of friendship paradoxically antisocial, driving the small clique of friends away from their larger society. This sort of friendship seeks to individuate and elevate, not to integrate. The kind of isolation that's celebrated by a poem like Guido Ivorei is irreconcilable with the sense of sociability and community that the penitents must develop. The pilgrim learns this early in his ascent, in a scene that I just alluded to, when Cato condemns Casella's song as a pleasurable but dangerous distraction, interrupting the negligent souls as they listen, come nessun toccasse altro la mente, as if nothing else touched anyone's mind. The song dangerously diverts the pilgrim and the new arrivals to the mountain, not only in its content, as many have shown, but also in its form. The episode contrasts the solitary voice of the lone singer, individuated from and celebrated by the crowd, with the choral, communal voices of the penitents who had banded together to sing the psalm as they approached the mountain. And I love this image here in particular because I think it really shows how the individual pairing of Dante and Casella seems to disrupt the group's harmony. Right? You can see the faces of the different individuals are turning in different directions, some turning this way and some turning that way, as if they're puzzled by what's happening in this union of two. So Cato's admonishment draws the souls back from nostalgia to the delights of the world, which the episode suggests include the exclusions of private amistadi. Here in purgatory, exclusionary amistad must be set aside in favor of a sociability that would integrate the penitents into a single community. And so individual friendship, like philosophy and lyric song, appears to be rejected by Cato's dismissal, a distraction, however pleasurable, from the solitary but also communitarian work of purgatory. It seems that the vasellos neletto leggero, the vessel so swift and light that ferries Casella and his shipmates to the shore here in Purgatorio 2, depicted here by Blake in the image on your right, that this ship explicitly recalls the ship of friendship that carries the three young men on their whimsical journey on the placid and the endless seas of friendly discourse. At this point, we might imagine that the vasello of Purgatorio recalls the earlier sonnet's Vazel to reject it, the canticle dismissing the pleasures of friendship as a diversion from the labors of penitence. And yet, surprisingly, the metaphor of the ship of friendship returns once again higher up the mountain, this time in exchange with another Florentine friend, a poet of a different register, Forese Donati. Before his death in 1296, Forese had traded with the young Dante a series of vulgar, mutually offensive sonnets, a backstory that has been much discussed in scholarly treatment of the two poets' later encounter on the mountain. But what's more relevant for the present purposes here is not the past performance of their friendship, but how friendship is performed in their dialogue in this new space. Whereas Guido Ivorei removes the group of young poets from the vicissitudes of urban life, the verses of Purgatorio 23 and 24 immerse Dante and Forese in reflection on it. Forese recalls his wife, become beloved in his memory, his family, and the misery wrought on Florence through their political machinations, the scandalous dress of the svergognate of the city. The pilgrim, in turn, recalls his own sinful behavior, specifically his obscure sinful past with Forese. He recalls the beginnings of his journey in the dark wood and its goal, reunion with Beatrice. Their reflections are local, particular and historically specific. In their conversation, they conjure a Florence where both friendship and vice can flourish. But they do so without nostalgia for a bygone past, whether personal or civic, and with an eye to their current setting on the Terrace of Gluttony. Rather than linger in wistful recollections, the pilgrim and his friend hasten their steps. Forese with his eyes to his companions and their communal cleansing, Dante with his own fixed on salvation and Beatrice. Their companionship makes the movement all the easier. Nel dir d'andar, nell'andar lui più lento faceva, ma ragionando andavan forte, sì come nave pinta da buon vento. Both men walk briskly toward their goals, each driven forward by his delight in his friend's company and conversation. They move along forte, their ragionar ferrying them forward, as if in a ship carried by a buon vento swiftly toward its destination. It's thus here in Purgatory that Dante and Forese seem to have finally realized that dream of perfect companionship wished for in Vieux Vorrei, a ship blown by a strong wind that allows them to delight in their ragionamenti. But the purgatorial ship, no longer a vaselle as before, but a nave, that carries the two pilgrims toward their respective goals, moves purposefully and for a period of delimited time, in contrast to the ragionar sempre celebrated in the earlier poem. It's the boundless, whimsical discussion, this literal and figurative getting carried away as both ship and conversation drift aimlessly, that submission to the mountain structures of penitence will correct. This is the crucial difference between the ship that the young Dante wishes to share with Guido and the one that he now shares with Forese in his middle age. While Guido's vaselle moves aimlessly, directed by nothing save the caprice of its passengers, this is his "Ad ogni vento che mar andasse al voler vostro e mio," Forese's nave finds itself with a strong tailwind, pinta da buon vento, rushed swiftly along the mountainside toward its proper port. Where the former was free to follow its whims in endless directionless motion, this ship hastens toward its coveted destination, which is not only paradise, not only God, but also the communion of the blessed who will welcome the newly purged soul. So we might see the collective practices of purgatory as a diminishment of the individual, setting aside the individual for the sake of God or of the collective. But the impetus of purgatorial practices is a reinforcement of the individual through the distinct mirroring of the one in the other. Far from being impeded by the dyadic structure of individual friendship, purgatory's two-pronged assault on misguided will, one individual and the other communal, is facilitated by friendship, which uniquely bridges individual and communal forms of love. Unlike the exclusionary portrait of friendship that Dante developed in his early lyric, purgatorial friendship anticipates, at the level of the individual, the kind of love that the penitent must learn to cultivate for each member of the entire community. Recognizing in the companion the alter idem that friendship aims to uncover, permits each penitent to imagine the possibility of an other same in any of his or her compatriots within a particular social field of that terrace. Each instance of individual recognition of self and the other trains the penitents toward mastery of a new kind of civic friendship, one that begins from two individuals and then radiates outward to eventually encompass the whole polis. Because Christian friendship is not grounded in love of self, but in celebration of other, it is able to accommodate each within its reach. This phenomenon is what Janet Soskis, writing widely on Christian friendship, calls an anthropology of the at least two. That friendship in and with God does not seek in the other a reflection of the self, but rather celebrates the distinctiveness of the other. She writes, and I'm quoting, "Within an anthropology of the at least two, the friend is not a blank sheet for the free play of my emotions or a mirror for my virtues. Nor are the friends aligned in Cicero's symmetrical and essentially static perfection. Rather, I am becoming myself in and through who I am for others and who they are for me. Friendship is in this sense an eschatological relationship, for it has as much to do with what I may become as what I now am." One hears in Soskis's description an echo of the words of the pilgrim, who grieves as he recalls with Forese, "Qual fosti meco, e qual io teco fui." By recognizing distinctly who Forese was and is, the pilgrim is able to see more precisely who he himself was and is. recognizing self and other will be necessary for him to complete his passage through the penitential terraces. But the two friends do not dwell on what they have been for one another. This is part of the reason that the scholarly apparatus has become so fixated on the idea of, like, what is this obscure sinful past with Forese that Dante alludes to? Rather, here on the terrace of gluttony, they rely on their distinct experiences of one another's dynamic and developing sense of self to become what the purgatorial process has ordained for each of them. One leaning on the other, they look forward toward a future in which they can celebrate qual sarà amico e qual io teco sarò. So I'm nearing the end of my time, but in the spirit of these research seminars, I want to perhaps unadvisedly say a few words that I think complicate the picture of friendship in the Comedian. So we see that friendship in Purgatorio, even as it eschews the name amistà or amicizia, looks like a mutual exercise of virtue that allows each to better self and other at the same time. It is private, but not inward turning. It is individual, but not exclusionary. It is non-competitive, because virtue is not a limited good, but it nevertheless presents significant benefit to the self. And it is not assimilative, even if it is unitive. It brings two distinct individuals together, bonding them to one another, not despite, but because of their differences. In friendship with one another, one is recognized and celebrated as both alter and idem. So in the book, I conclude that certain forms of friendship, which are in Purgatorio relabeled as brotherhood, act as a training ground for participation in carità. When friendships are goal-directed, oriented toward virtue, mutually beneficial, non-competitive, non-possessive, they aid in the mastery of virtue toward which the practices of purgation mean to dispose the penitents. But what about in paradise? If the social field of purgatory is dynamic, as friends use their relationships to affirm their personal identities and to sustain their companions' moral growth, what can we make of the sociability of the saints? The blessed have, in theory at least, successfully moved beyond the becoming that characterizes purgatorial friendship, as each one leans on neighbors to support the other's engagement and success, as well as one's own. Having attained mastery of the sense of virtue that the penitents of purgatory strive towards, the souls of the blessed, we might imagine, no longer have need of preferential friendships. Picardo Donati, Forese's sister, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. There's a beautiful image from Dore that'll move past. Forese's sister, Picardo Donati, effectively says as much to the pilgrim when they meet in the heaven of the moon, correcting the pilgrim's emphasis on preferential amistà by redirecting his question toward the carità shared by the blessed souls of God. I'm not going to read this long citation, but I encourage you to look at it. As he ascends the heavens, the pilgrim too must learn to direct his attentions to divine carità over human amistà. Friendships may persist, but no longer in their preferential forms. Rather, they operate according to a principle of diffuse reflection, each soul reflecting divine carità as one mirror to another. Without sacrificing one's identity as a singular participant in that reflection, one also realizes the truth of one's reality as grounded in the source of being, in the source of being itself, thus effacing without annulling the boundary that separates self from other. Theoretically, this reflection can't be premised on one soul's individuation or election of another. Friendship in the realms of salvation must be transmuted from its previous instantiations. It must uncover concord where there had been willful self-interest. It must move beyond preference without abandoning hierarchy. It must recognize the difference of each one while maintaining focus on the collective identity of all beings as divine being. So what then, in light of this discussion, are we to make of Beatrice's appellation, l'amico mio e non dell'avventura, with which I began this talk? It's nothing new to say that Beatrice is the pilgrim's unique conduit to divine love. But we must ask ourselves, what will happen to his particular attachment to her once the pilgrim's soul has formally attained paradise? Will he still consider her his beloved Beatrice, his mediator of divine love? And will she still call him amico mio? So one place that scholars have looked for an answer to the question of individual love among the blessed is the pilgrim's discussion with Solomon on the resurrection of the flesh. So in Paradiso 14, this is an image from 12, but you get the idea. You might remember Solomon explains to the pilgrim the mystery of the glorified body, the flesh resurrected and restored to the soul after the end of history, when the dead will enjoy the ardent brightness of paradise in their bodies. The souls in the heaven of the sun cry out, Amme, in celebration of the anticipated moment, and Dante pauses to give an explanation. Tanto mi parve subiti accorti, e l'una e l'altro cora dicer Amme, che ben mostra l'isio dei corpi morti, forse non pur per loro, ma per le mamme, per i padri e per gli altri che fuor cari, anzi che fosse sempiterne fiamme. This passage has been cited as Solomon's affirmation of individual attachments, which the blessed still enjoy in paradise, and which they will enjoy all the more when they're invited to see the bodies of their dear ones once again. But I want to highlight two things. First, that this isn't Solomon's explanation, but the still human poet's, who seeks to comprehend and justify the intense ardor that the pilgrim witnesses in the blessed souls. But second, and perhaps more poignantly, what I find more poignantly, I highlight this word forse. Perhaps. Perhaps, the poet says. The flash of enthusiasm displays their eagerness for their loved ones to be reunited with their bodies as if an expression of their continued affection for them. But perhaps not. An equally plausible explanation here is that the all-too-human poet has once again misinterpreted the affections of the saints as a preferential one. That the still human poet may cling to the particular attachments of earthly paradise is suggested by the pilgrim's momentary glimpse of full ecstatic attention in Paradiso 10, just as he and Beatrice ascend to the sun, where the conversation with Solomon will unfold. This is an easily overlooked, fleeting exchange between Dante and Beatrice. I was so delighted to find Botticelli's illustration of this, because I've yet to find another illustration where Dante is not looking at Beatrice, but looking beyond her. This is the only one that I could find, and it happens to be this exact moment that I'm talking about. So this is a passage that I find particularly suggestive of the ways in which individual friendships will not be displaced, but eclipsed by the fires of heavenly ardor. To prepare for the ascent to the heaven of the sun, the pilgrim centers all his attention on the intense light of what he describes as the quarta famiglia dell'Alto Padre, che sempre la sazia, the fourth family of the High Father who always satisfies them. Beatrice encourages his concentration by stoking his gratitude, and the pilgrim directs his focus toward the sun and its abundant light. Heartened by Beatrice's words and bypassing her eyes, her smile, and her splendor, the pilgrim concentrates all his awareness and his love exclusively on the source, unmediated by any other intercessor. He says, Cor di mortal non fu mai sì digesto a divozione e a rendersi a Dio con tutto il suo gradir tanto presto, come a quelle parole che fec'io, e sì tutto il mio amore in lui si mise che Beatrice eclissò nell'oblio. The eclipse of Beatrice, as well as the pilgrim's capacity to forget her momentarily in his fleeting, rapturous attention to divine being, foreshadows the pilgrim's direct encounter with God, appropriately guided by Bernard of Clairvaux after Beatrice has ascended to rejoin the heavenly ranks. But they also foreshadow the eventual subsumption of the pilgrim's particular attachment to his beloved Beatrice in his refocused attentions. Directed by Beatrice's call to gratitude, the pilgrim does not supplant her as the object of his affection, but instead passes through her love to rendersi a Dio con tutto il suo gradir. The eclipse of Beatrice's love is not a displacement, but a dilation, as his ardor enlarges to accommodate his increased affections. Beatrice's response to her own eclipse in the pilgrim's mind confirms that he has directed his attentions carefully and correctly. The pilgrim forgets Beatrice only for a passing moment. Immediately afterwards, he'll again see her laughing eyes and dazzling smile, which will bring him back from the marvel of the unified creator to the plurality of created phenomena. That smile is triggered by her assent of his forgetfulness. Non le dispiacque, ma sì se ne rese che lo splendor degli occhi suoi ridenti, mia mente unita in più cose grise. She assents to his forgetting her. But the smile that accompanies her assent brings him back from his absorption into the highest order to the lower, but still splendid, beauty of creation. In the flash of dilectio Dei enjoyed in this moment, all lower forms of love have been subsumed into the one love of carità, which directs its devotion and concentration entirely on the source, conforming its agency to the divine will and rendering all other loves the specular reflections of this central focus. In a glimpse of ecstatic vision, the pilgrim finds his mind unita, united with the divine mind, as its alter idem. Other, but so conjoined with it in likeness as to behold the forma universal that is the ground of being. The plurality of creation is not resolved in the unity that Dante glimpses, but is coextensive with it. The ethical dilemmas that friendship raises for the medieval Christian poet, inclusivity and exclusivity, disinterestedness and advantage, hierarchy and equality, difference and identity, remain unsettled in the Commedia. These dilemmas are not resolved in the figure of Beatrice and her personal affection for the pilgrim. Hers is not a new and special friendship that reduces the ethical ambiguities of this relationship to a singular, inimitable reconciliation of eros, philia, and caritas in one unique instantiation. Beatrice's friendship is, rather, an intensification of those ambiguities, her particular affection for the pilgrim becoming the mirror through which the complexities and contradictions friendship introduces in Christian ethics are reflected and amplified. In their particularity and alterity, each of our friends sustains us in the project of becoming ourselves, unfolding the coherence in our identities, and in their distinction from us, mirroring back to us our uniqueness. At the same time, the boundaries of those plural and differentiated identities become, in the light of divine love, as distinct as a pearl on a white forehead. Within an anthropology of the at least two, particular loves dilate, accommodating first a third, then a fourth, and so forth, until they embrace all within their diffuse grasp. It's thus that these individual attachments participate in the love that is God. The intersubjective love of the one for the other, an alter idem which, in its distinctiveness, reveals its likeness both with the one and with the divine, unfolds through the various paradoxes of relational identity and social life. In the final analysis, the dilemmas of friendship stand, sustained by the pilgrim's persistent dubio and the poet's unrelenting forse. From this eschatological perspective, then, friendship is not an end, but a beginning. This brings me to my conclusion. So we may have expected that the Commedia, in its encyclopedism or its sacrality, would resolve the dilemmas of friendship that I discuss in the book. But the Commedia offers little resolution, instead answering the wisdom of a Solomon with the poet's persistent forse. As all the texts under discussion in the book show, Dante is a poet who delights in unresolved paradoxes, tensions, dilemmas, and doubts. Paradiso in particular fluctuates between fixed doctrinal knowledge and spontaneous human practice, between ardent conviction and implacable doubt. That battle between doubt and certainty, a battle that drives the will to cohere with the intellect so that it can sustain its clashes with the heavens, which would incline it toward incoherence, is at the very root of what it means to be human. Confronting the irresolvable ambiguities of being in the world, both alone and with others, is for Dante our most pressing ethical responsibility. While arguably these tensions are universal to friendships in complex communities, writerly attention to amicizia in Due in Trecento Italy demonstrates the function and nature of the language of friendship during an important phase of social and political redefinition and reorganization. A study of the strategic employ of the language of amicizia, amistà, and related terms in specific fields of social interaction reveals how Dante and his interlocutors dramatically widened amicizia's semantic range, introducing to friendship a new breadth of instrumental advantages while still striving to preserve its Christian and Ciceronian heritage. Attention to the ambiguous language of friendship thus reveals the ways that individuals like Dante paved the way for the recuperation of individualized, hierarchical, and instrumental friendship, which would become commonplace among Renaissance intellectuals. I'm going to stop there because I've already taken enough of your time and attention, but I'm very delighted and eager to open the discussion to your questions and comments. So thank you so much for your time.
Please, Nicole.
Maybe start and then maybe other people will jump in with more interesting questions. But thank you very much for your presentation. I have two very fast questions. One is about methodology, and one is about the content. The first one is, if I well understood, you focus your attention on Vita Nova, the Vulgare Eloquentia, the Epistole to Can Grande della Scala, and the Commedia.
Yes.
Why not the rhymes?
Why not?
The rhymes, le rime.
I mean, mean, the E may come up in the chapter on the Vita Nova, but the Vita Nova is really, yeah, it's a consolidation of what he says in the Vita. I mean, not entirely a consolidation, but the structure of the book is more based on the dilemmas than it is on the texts in which those dilemmas take shape. And so I was really thinking about, especially as I thought about my own friendships and I thought about theory and practice of friendship, I started to recognize that Aristotle and Cicero don't entirely cohere on a lot of questions of friendship, and certainly don't cohere with Christian authorities on friendship. So I was thinking about the ways that monastic practices of friendship would often, the monastic orders would often dismiss friendship as exclusionary and bad for the community, bad for community building. And then I thought, well, what happens in the Renaissance? Like, what happens in this transitional moment? And so I started by identifying the dilemmas, and then the texts seem to emerge as texts in which the dilemmas are really heightened. So I don't write much about convivio, for example. Convivio is another one where friendship is at the forefront of what Dante is thinking about.
It's true, there's also a lot of Cicero in the Convivio, but I was thinking about something more terrestrial, like for example the relationship with Forese Donati.
Right.
Because it's another kind of friendship that could maybe interest your analysis, which is less philosophical maybe and more
practical.
More practical, and also more comical, if I may say, but it would be another perspective. I was curious to see and to know more if you can get into it a little bit.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I focused on in the book is the ways that the terminology of friendship is used. And in the Tensone of Forese, they don't use the term friend. It's the same in Guido Ibarre, right? Guido Ibarre also used the term friend. Yeah.
That's
I mean, I think the Tensone of Forese I find fascinating, particularly because it feels so modern in its expression of friendship. It is.
It was very common.
Exactly. It's competitive. There's a great quote in Cicero's De Amicizia where he says that the best kinds of friendship form what he calls a rivalry of virtue. And you feel that sense of rivalry very much in that Tensone, right? You feel that sense of two competitors who are trying to outdo one another, showing off their own virtue by setting apart the other as being vicious. They don't become competitors of virtue in the way that Cicero is imagining, right? They become sort of competitors who say, "You are so terrible, and that makes me so so virtuous in comparison," right? And yet it's clear that this is, like I said, it seems like a very modern form of friendship. It doesn't, I'm interested in it when I think about Dante's biography. But when I'm thinking about the integration of theory with practice, it kind of fell to the wayside. In the same way that Convivio fell to the wayside in a way that I would have loved to spend a whole chapter writing about Convivio. But I wove it in strategically in places, not writing an entire chapter on it because it doesn't correspond to friendship and practice. It's only thinking theoretically. And in fact, it's only thinking about friendship between Dante and philosophy, or between lord and servant, but not in the real world, only in these kind of theoretical orientations. And so I was looking for friendships that integrate both theory and practice in the same space. The book could have been 600 pages long, but I didn't want it to be.
Thank you very much. And my second question regards Beatrice.
She's the sticky wicket of this project.
You're right. And I was thinking about when you quoted l'amico mio non dell'avventura, which is the place in which, if I'm not wrong, is the first time we hear the voice of Beatrice in the entire Dante's production.
Yeah.
And you quoted, you talked about the Song of Songs, like l'amica mia. But I was thinking about the Provençal literature when amiz, amiga is used in a, let's say, in a kind of way which is not that different rather than the Song of Songs, but it recalls about a different environment and a different kind of literature. And I wanted to ask you, is that maybe the place in which Dante wants to tell us something regarding the changing in the relationship between him and Beatrice, letting her speaking like Dante, when sees Beatrice in Purgatorio Furli, it's clearly still in love, because he's seeing her. I mean, I could put it, I can't, but I won't, but we know the passage. But Beatrice immediately says to Virgilio, hey, be careful, he's my friend, but not of Ventura, which is, yes, Fortuna, but is also, it's a kind of Fortuna that recalls a more carnal relationship between human. I mean, it's...
The relationship between, I'm sorry?
It's a kind of carnal relationship between him and her, like, non è il mio amante, he's not my lover, in that meaning. So, can you say something more about this kind of passage? It's just my perception that he's using Beatrice in order to say, okay, I'm changing perspective, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that she says it in Inferno 2 and doesn't repeat it, it doesn't come up again.
Yeah.
And it says something to us about that word, right? That word ends up getting set aside, especially in Purgatorio. I think the fact that it's Virgil that says it, voicing her, of course, but it's Virgil reporting that says something about the use of that word. You know, for all I know, she's using language that Virgil will understand, so that he can then report it to the pilgrim. Her use of especially the possessive there, the mio part of that, feels distinctly out of place with how we come to understand friendship across Paradiso. I mean, especially if you contrast it with what Picarda says when Dante asks, "What are you going to do? Like, don't you wish to be più farvi amici, right? To become closer amici of God?" And she says, "No, la nostra carità quiets that desire, quiets that impulse." And so friendship, this kind of preferential friendship, gets set aside. So that's why I'm still puzzling over what to make of Beatrice's amico mio in that sense. I think, of course, it has all these echoes with these other traditions. I was talking with one of my graduate students who said, well, what else would she call him? Like, how else could she possibly refer to him? And I agree, how else could she possibly refer to him?
Because we have in mind the Vita Nova.
The Vita Nova, I mean, he doesn't use the word friendship in Vita Nova, he refers to, the
It's not about the word as the word itself, but the meaning of the word. He's kind of summarizing a long relationship for the Vita Nova in just one word. I mean, that's also an ability that Dante has.
But I think to me it's the fact of how the word gets contested that's what I'm interested in this project. The fact that the word comes to stand for so many different things, and the fact that word is what is used to articulate so many different kinds of relationship. That's what I find really fascinating about it. And I think the Commedia sets things aside. I'm sorry, the Commedia does something so different with friendship with respect to the rest of his works, in part by setting aside that term and favoring other terms. I don't know if I've answered your question. I don't think there is an answer to your question.
No, but thank you.
I just think about it because, of course, La Donna Mia,
Right.
which isn't a possessive either. You know, and La Donna has very much its etymological sense of the mistress, the master mistress. You know? And but Beatrice, in that sense, if you're picking up from the Vita Nova, should use the mirror image of that. He's her servidor or something, and you know. But it's not that. It's amico, which is again kind of striking.
It elevates that it promotes a kind of equality between them that hasn't existed previous to this. And so it's suggestive of that, but at the same time, there is no equality with how could Dante claim an equality with Beatrice? In the same way that he would never claim an equality with Can Grande, and yet he does in the epistle. There are all of these contradictions that come up in the use of that term. I think to me I know it's not I don't find it a satisfying answer, but I don't think that those dilemmas are resolved.
But if I may, I don't see a contradiction in using amico mio by the woman, because the relationship between still in Provençal literature, and I've done, sorry if I insist, but still in Provençal literature, the lover called the woman domina, la mia donna. But the woman couldn't say my lord, because the lord was the man that was married to her.
Right.
They normally say l'amico mio. And it's a, I use the language, I mean, and that's why I need to.
And that's why I acknowledged to that at the beginning of the time when I first bring up the term. For me, it's important to know that it has all of these resonances, that it has all of these historical resonances. But then Dante appears to move beyond that term.
Christian, please, yeah.
No,
So,
it's just someone else should go.
Yeah, we should get the conversation
Okay,
going.
okay.
I'm a little uncomfortable with this self and other, you know, it's so dual. And to me, it becomes a problem in the analysis of the comedy. I think it works better in the other works, but this, you know, if you think of dilemma, duality, doubles, you know, I feel uncomfortable with that in the context of the comedy. And so to take an example, your example of Forese, which you explicated very well given your approach, but it's not, there's Nella, you know, it's not just two. It's a trinity. You know, often in Dante you end up finding threes. You know, you have a two or a three, but the threes are foundational. And in that respect, just to ask a question, have you thought or do you develop, it seems to me it would be interesting to develop the concept of family in relation to friendship, because in fact you go from Forese to Picarda, you know, the Donati family. In the relationship between Forese and Nella, there's even an echo of Dante's relationship with Gemma, possibly. And so I was wondering if you'd share some reflections on how the friendship thing, I mean, it's kind of asking you to extemporaneously just kind of riff on it, so it's not fair, I guess. But I'm assuming that you've thought about that.
I mean, the big familial relationship that comes out in Coggeshall is, of course, brotherhood. That when the penitents refer to the pilgrim, they no longer say amico mio or anything of the sort. They say frate.
Yeah.
Frate mio. And they use the possessive again. Or I don't know if you want to call it a possessive or not. But so relationships that we would normally consider, that we would normally construe as friendship, that would have been construed as friendship in his earlier works, are now thought of as brotherhood or sisterhood.
Yeah.
They're all familial relationships. There are, as we all know, very few spouses in directly reference to Nella being an important exception. There are, of course, others.
There are some.
But the relationship of siblings seems to be the one that's most palpable here, the one that's most important for the conception of community. That it starts from two, importantly, and then emerges to. I mean, this is what I love about Soskis's definition, right? That it's an anthropology of the at least two. That it begins with two, and then it can continue to accommodate others.
But even the heaven of the sun is breaking down dualities. You know, it's breaking down the idea of juxtapositionings or it's breaking down the concept of debate in that sense. I'm sorry.
I would say, on the same point, I was struck by that image of the eclipse. And here I speak, you know, from a very 20th century perspective, I suppose, but I was wondering about the metaphorical entailments of eclipse, right? Because we use that sort of loosely to say surpassed, right? His famous eclipse. But that isn't what an eclipse is, and Dante seems much too smart to be using it that loosely there, that as you're talking about, like what relationship precisely that would entail metaphorically, to say that friendship in one sense is eclipse.
Well, yeah, when I talk about the eclipse, I don't mean to suggest that it's somehow supplanted, right? But that it passes beyond, right? That it, and this is why I like the idea of the boundaries of friendship expanding beyond the individual to then turn its attention at something else. Yeah.
The way I would think of it is that these things are not mutually exclusive because we're dealing with different planes of existence, and it depends on where one's love and attention is. You know, there's obviously the famous inluiarsi, intuarsi, inviarsi. You know, that's kind of key because the fact is that these souls at that stage are able to experience themselves as the reality that is actually one in all, that consciousness and love that is the foundation, but that then manifests itself in space and time and so forth as individuals. Those are not mutually exclusive,
Right.
but you can shift register.
Right.
And then when a certain portion of your love and awareness is constantly focused in that universal dimension, of course, that also colors your experience and practice of the individual. So it's no longer mutually exclusive, and yet it still is an individual friendship. But I think that's the kind of the key is that and as you move into paradise, the focus, you know, which is that universal unitary realm, the one and the many, which is emergent in purgatory, and they're learning to live in it and learning to discover it. Of course, that becomes ascendant, if anything, in paradise, which is why the emphasis is less on the individual exclusive. It's not like it's not there in a sense. It's just that that's not how they're experiencing it. It's not annihilated, it's not denied, it's not negated, it's not transcended. It's all still there, but it's just not the way they're living it at that moment, or the way they're living it makes it look different.
This is what I was trying to articulate, but
Yeah, I got it,
Yes.
actually. You said that, actually. but I was thinking maybe if you brought up like the inluiarsi thing, that's a good
Yes.
way of getting at.
yes,
At that other level,
I bring it up in the book.
Yeah, and I saw you actually referred to it in the slide too.
Yeah, and John Took has that beautiful essay on it that I always teach to my students, and they always get furious with me because they're like, this is absolute gobbledygook, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
To an undergraduate student certainly, and to a master's student even the same. But yes, I mean this is the challenge of articulating these. I mean, this is what I mean when I say that I told Christian earlier that I was walking around campus and sort of recalling my experience of being an undergraduate here and my first exposures to the poem being in his courses, and the challenge of articulating something that is a dilemma that is unresolved, that remains a doubt and yet is expressed with conviction, that is sort of all things, it's sort of both things, sustaining both things at once. I think is incredibly challenging. That was one of the biggest challenges in this project. One of them. Are there any questions from the students?
No, I was just wondering, what do you think of the use of the term amico that Francesca Derimini makes?
Yes,
in
yes. Yes.
Because she is in some way the emblem of court literature. She also makes a reference to a hierarchical relationship, and also, like, she kind of implies that the friendship means the possibility of taking action on things. So,
I don't know what you mean. Tell me what you mean.
like in the sense that if she had a relationship with God, she would be able to pray for them.
Yes,
in
yes,
salvation.
okay. Yeah.
So, in a sense, like friendship as the ability of taking actions on things.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in those terms, and I really love that. That's a really beautiful reflection on Francesca's use of the term. One of the things that I thought about that I find, this is returns to the problem of dilemmas in writing about Commedia, is that Francesca insists on a kind of exclusionary nature to God's friendship, right? Se fosse amico. And he's not, of course, and so that's why I'm here, and that's why I can't pray for you, and that's why I can't do X, Y, and Z. She's not wrong that the love of God as it's presented in the Commedia is in some ways exclusionary. I mean, that the damned are certainly excluded from that friendship with God. This is one of the things that I think that when I'm thinking about sort of from a theological perspective, I don't want to imagine that God's love would exclude some. And yet, the language of friendship, when it does arrive in Paradiso, it arrives a couple of times to refer to certain friends of God. I'm forgetting the exact verses at the moment, but in the chapter in the Commedia I talk about this. When it does arrive, it is to talk about how certain friends of the divine are, the blessed are friends of God, and others presumably are not. Figures like Francesco.
But that's their doing, not God.
As they're doing it, of course, as they're doing
She
it.
thinks he's not a friend,
Of
and that's
course.
one of the great ironies. Of course he's a friend.
Of
She's
course.
decided he's not.
It's
Therefore he's
her
not.
choice to turn towards that friendship or not, right, of course. And she chooses to exclude
Yeah,
herself
she's
from that
excluding
reality.
herself.
But it is true that it's possible to exclude yourself, and I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that that you know when we think in theological terms, it can be challenging to imagine the love of something like the divine, which is you know, we imagine it as extending in all directions at all times. It does extend in all directions at all times. This is what Virgil tells us in the middle of Purgatorio, and yet we can turn away from it, and so we can exclude ourselves. That does not answer your beautiful question about action, but I'll think about that one. Thank you.
You know, if you don't write an article about this, I think I might, the family thing. I was thinking Nino Visconti is
Yes.
another
St.
one.
Peter,
Yes.
Judy should-
Nino Visconti is another one. who-
La Mia, is that what her name is? Yeah.
Well, and she she gets another husband,
Right.
and he's worried about what the burial, what the tomb, the sepulcher, how it would be decorated with the family stem. And, you know, I just suspect, because Dante's so original, that he is not innovative in thinking about the dynamics of friendship and family, spouses. You know, you don't see much about that,
Yeah, it's true.
but it's there, I think. And it's, I feel that it's part of the reflection. I mean, I ask you, you know, was it ever theorized? What's the relationship between a husband and a spouse or family members in relation to the concept of friendship as you were developing?
The only project that, I mean, I know of two projects that are related to friendship between spouses in Renaissance materials, but not in medieval materials. I don't know of any related to them. And if you want to write that article, Ted, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
I don't think that I will. I like loving my spouse. I don't need to write about loving my spouse. I
Yeah,
loved writing about my friends. That was a joy.
okay, that's interesting.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and thank you very much for the Dante Today website as well, which I found fascinating and very useful,
Yes.
especially for teaching purposes.
Oh, I could talk all day long about that website.
It's an amazing project. Thank you very much for that. I have a kind of quick question, and it's about so the notion of friendship you described, especially in Purgatorio and Paradiso. I was wondering if that notion could be subsumed under the notion, for instance, of armonia, of concordia, which explains in Monarchia, for instance, in the first book, as a sort of individuality and collective ends at the same time. So perhaps you see any sort of similarities between the notion of friendship you described and the notion of concordia or harmony, I would say, described, for instance, in the Monarchia.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of literature on friendship as concordia because of the definition of Cicero, that friendship is rerum humanarum et divinarum consensio, right? So the idea of arriving at concord on matters human and divine. And so there's a great deal of literature on concord, both in Cicero and his heritage. Also Aquinas uses the language of concordia in some of his writings on friendship. I hadn't put the Monarchia together with this project, but that's a wonderful suggestion, and I'll continue to think about that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the idea of arriving at concord is an important one, especially when we think about, say, the early lyrics, the Tenzoni, the relationship with Guido, the idea that one works with a friend with whom one disagrees to arrive at some kind of, if not concord, at least mutual respect, at least mutual understanding. I think that's really powerful in the Tenzoni of the period.
Thank you.
Thank you.